There, all done. The officer's voice was a low growl, thick with a smug satisfaction that was far more chilling than a shout. He gave the man a hard shove forward. Let's see you talk your way out of this one. Smart ass. You think you're special? You're just another jerk who thinks the rules don't apply to him. Now, you learn. The cold, final click of the handcuffs echoed on the quiet street, a sound that seemed to break the silence of the night itself. Metal bit into skin. Red and blue lights from the cruiser slashed across the scene, painting grotesque, dancing shadows on the brick walls of sleeping houses. In the chaotic glare, two figures were locked in a silent tableau, a silhouette of quiet, unbowed dignity, his hands bound behind him, and the bulky shape of a predator in uniform, standing over him, triumphant. What brought these two men to this moment on this forgotten stretch of road? What unseen crime had earned such venomous pleasure from the lawman? This story isn't just about a pair of handcuffs. It's a tangled tale of power, of prejudice, and of the bitter metallic taste of injustice. Every state, every town has its own unwritten rules about who belongs and who doesn't. What are the rules where you live, and who gets to enforce them? Let us know in the comments below. If stories like this matter to you, make sure you like this video, share it to spread awareness, and subscribe for more content that uncovers the truth. Port Blossom existed in a state of perpetual conversation with the sea. The town was built into the curve of a deep, natural harbor, a fact that had dictated its character for over 200 years. The air itself was a briny marinade, a thick concoction of salt, diesel from the fishing trawlers, and the faint, low-tide perfume of decay and life. On clear days, the sun would glint off the restless gray-green water, but more often than not, a persistent marine layer would creep in, muffling the world in a soft, damp blanket of fog. Sounds traveled differently here. The mournful bellow of a distant foghorn, the sharp, almost frantic cries of gulls, the rhythmic chugging of a lobster boat heading out before dawn. They were not mere noises, but the town's very pulse. The geography of the town was a stark and honest map of its social strata. Huddled near the docks, as if for warmth and solidarity, were the weathered, clapboard houses of the town's foundation. Generations of fishermen, shipwrights, and cannery workers had been born and had died in these salt-scoured homes, their walls holding the faint scent of fried fish and damp wool, paint peeled from their siding in long, curling strips, like sunburnt skin, and their small yards were often cluttered with the practical detritus of a life lived by the ocean. Stacked lobster pots, coiled nets, and rusted buoys. These were the streets of Old Port Blossom, where roots ran as deep and tangled as the kelp beds offshore. Perched high above, on the dramatic, windswept cliffs that overlooked the ocean, sat a different world. Here, the grander homes of a newer Port Blossom stood in stark, architectural judgment. These were structures of glass and steel and polished cedar, with vast picture windows designed to capture the sublime coastal views, turning the turbulent sea into a living piece of art. Their lawns were immaculate, emerald green carpets that seemed to defy the salty air, and their long, winding driveways were home to imported sedans and luxury SUVs. This was where the money had landed, a place of quiet, protected privilege that felt a world away from the grit and noise of the working harbor below. For decades, this delicate, unspoken balance had held, but the last 20 years had seen a steady, then relentless, influx of people from the sprawling inland cities. They were drawn by the same things that had always defined the town: the cleansing ocean air, the promise of a slower, more meaningful pace of life, and the postcard charm of a place that felt rooted in a simpler American history. They came with city money and city sensibilities, opening artisanal bakeries where simple donut shops once stood, and converting old waterfront warehouses into minimalist art galleries. This created an uneasy, often silent, friction. The longtime locals, who saw their property taxes climb and their children priced out of the neighborhoods their families had helped build, watched the newcomers with a quiet, simmering resentment. They saw them in the grocery store, dressed in expensive athletic wear, complaining about the lack of organic options. They heard them in town meetings, proposing noise ordinances that would disrupt the schedules of the fishing fleet. To the old guard, these new residents were not neighbors, but invaders, people who wanted to purchase the town's soul and then renovate it to their own liking. The newcomers, in turn, often viewed the locals with a kind of patronizing affection, seeing them as authentic, rustic characters in the story of their own idyllic sea change, oblivious to the economic anxieties their very presence created. Caught squarely in the middle of this demographic tug-of-war was the Port Blossom Police Department. It was a small, chronically underfunded force, operating out of a cramped brick building that always smelled of stale coffee and damp paperwork. Most of the officers were locals themselves, men who had grown up in the clapboard houses and were accustomed to dealing with the familiar dramas of a small town: bar fights, teenage vandalism, domestic disputes between families they'd known their whole lives. But the changing population had stretched them thin, not just in numbers, but in capability. They were ill-equipped to mediate the new, more complex conflicts that arose daily. They were now called to handle zoning disputes between a tech millionaire and a third-generation fisherman, to investigate complaints of trespassing on private cliffside trails that had been used by locals for a century, and to deal with a level of entitled belligerence from the wealthy newcomers that they found both baffling and infuriating. The force was overworked, undertrained for these new cultural challenges, and slowly beginning to fray under the constant, unrelenting pressure of policing a town at war with itself. This festering pressure within the department sought an outlet. For most officers, it manifested as a weary cynicism, a private grousing over beers after a long shift. But in some, the frustration curdled into something harder, a brittle and aggressive certainty. In a force struggling to find its footing, one man believed he had never lost his. He saw the town's anxieties not as a complex problem to be managed, but as a simple failure of will, a rot that needed to be carved out with a firm hand. And he believed he was the only one with the conviction to do it. A week before the main incident that would unravel his career, Officer Walter Jenkins sat alone in his usual booth at the Salty Dog Diner, a place that, like him, had resisted the town's relentless tide of change for 30 years. The red vinyl on the seat was cracked in a familiar pattern beneath him, and the air, thick with the smell of old frying oil and freshly brewed coffee, was a comfort. The waitress, a woman named Flo he'd known since high school, didn't even need to take his order anymore. A black coffee, strong and bitter, appeared before him moments after he sat down. This booth was his sanctuary, a fixed point in a world he felt was spinning off its axis. From here, he could watch the street, his street, and take the measure of the day. It was from this vantage point that he watched them, a family of four, seated at a table near the front window, bathed in the pale morning light. They were clearly new to town, marked by the clean, modern cut of their clothes and the easy, unself-conscious way they carried themselves. They were a black family, and in Jenkins's mind, that fact was inseparable from their newness, their otherness. He watched as they laughed, sharing bites of pancake from each other's plates. It wasn't a loud or disruptive sound, but it had a quality of bright, confident joy that grated on him, sounding alien and out of place against the diner's usual low murmur. His internal thoughts, a constant, grumbling monologue, began to sharpen. Used to know everyone in here, every face. Now, look at them, bringing their city noise, their city ways. Don't act like they're in Port Blossom. Act like Port Blossom belongs to them now. He saw their presence as a symptom of the disease, the slow erasure of the town he knew, the one his father and grandfather had helped build with their bare, calloused hands. He continued to stare over the rim of his coffee mug, his gaze flat and unblinking. The father of the family, catching his eye, offered a small, polite nod. a simple, universal gesture of shared space, of acknowledging another person's existence. Jenkins ignored it. He deliberately broke eye contact and looked out the window, his jaw tightening. The gesture, to him, was not one of politeness, but of presumption. It was an invitation into a world he didn't recognize and didn't want to. It's not the same, he thought, the bitterness rising in his throat. They smile, but it's a different kind of smile, the kind that says we're taking over. He took a long, slow sip of the scalding coffee, the heat doing nothing to warm the cold knot of resentment in his gut. His knuckles were bone white where he gripped the heavy ceramic mug, a small, contained act of violence in the quiet sanctuary of the diner. Officer Walter Jenkins was a Port Blossom native, born and raised in the salt-laced air. His family's roots in the town were deep, his father and grandfather having worked the unforgiving waters as fishermen. But Walter had chosen a different path. He had chosen the badge, seeing it not merely as a job, but as a sacred duty to protect the very fabric of the community his family had helped weave. Now, after 30 years on the force, he was nearing retirement, but the prospect brought him no peace. Instead, he felt a gnawing sense of failure, a profound anger that the town he had sworn to protect was being lost, not to crime in the traditional sense, but to a slow, insidious invasion of new people, new money, and new ideas that he simply could not stomach. He saw himself as the bedrock of the department, the last vestige of a more authentic, effective kind of law enforcement. He was the guy who wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty, a phrase he used with a certain pride. To him, it meant dealing with the messy, unpleasant realities of human nature directly, without hesitation or apology. He held a deep-seated contempt for the younger officers, the ones with their 4-year degrees in criminology and their talk of de-escalation tactics and community policing models. He considered these to be weak, effeminate concepts cooked up in classrooms by people who had never felt the visceral, adrenaline-soaked reality of a street confrontation. Real police work, in his view, wasn't about talking, it was about acting. It was about establishing control, swiftly and decisively. His philosophy, honed over 3 decades of patrols, was brutally simple. Show them who's boss and they'll fall in line. He believed the world was divided into 2 types of people, those who respected authority and those who needed to be reminded of it. The law, for Jenkins, was not an abstract concept of justice. It was a practical instrument for maintaining order. And order to him was a delicate thing, a state of being where everyone knew their place and showed the proper deference to the uniform and the badge that represented the town's enduring power structure. Any challenge to that order, no matter how small, was a crack in the dam that had to be immediately and forcefully sealed. This heavy-handed approach had earned him a nickname, one spoken only in hushed tones in the locker room or over beers when he wasn't around. Hammer. The younger officers, especially those who had felt the sting of his public rebukes, used it with a mixture of fear and resentment. They knew his reputation was well earned. He was the officer who would choose a physical takedown over a calm conversation, the one who saw a raised voice as a physical threat. They saw him as a relic, a blunt instrument in an age that called for scalpels, but a dangerous one they knew better than to cross directly. To understand Jenkins, one had to understand his relationship with his handcuffs. To him, the cuffs were not just a tool for restraining suspects. They were the ultimate symbol of his power, the final word in any argument. They were a statement. The satisfying, definitive click-click of the steel snapping shut was the sound of chaos being subdued, of defiance being crushed, of his will being irrevocably imposed on another human being. It was a tool of humiliation, designed to instantly strip someone of their agency and dignity. The act of forcing a person's hands behind their back, of binding them, was an intimate act of domination that transformed a belligerent, questioning individual into a compliant, helpless prisoner. In that moment, he felt a surge of validation, a profound sense of rightness and control that nothing else could provide. Because of this, he used them frequently, often for things that other officers would resolve with a stern warning or a simple citation. He was known for it. Any perceived disrespect, no matter how slight, was met with the swift application of steel. A teenager who used a sarcastic tone, a driver who argued too persistently about a traffic violation, a citizen who questioned his authority on the street, all were liable to feel the cold, unforgiving bite of his cuffs. To Walter Jenkins, disrespect was a far greater transgression than the minor infraction that had initiated the contact. It was a direct challenge to the order of his world, and for that, there was only one appropriate response. This brutal philosophy was not an abstract theory for Jenkins. It was a practiced, operational reality. His internal ledger of slights and challenges was long, and his response was chillingly consistent. The targets of his punitive authority were rarely hardened criminals. More often, they were individuals who, in his biased estimation, failed to occupy their proper place in the town's hierarchy. They were the newcomers who seemed too confident, the young who acted too defiant, and anyone whose face or mannerisms marked them as an outsider. This tendency found a perfect subject one Tuesday afternoon in early spring. In the person of a young woman who had committed the dual sins of making an honest mistake and failing to be intimidated. Clara Chen had poured her life and a significant portion of her and her husband's savings into the title gallery. It was her dream, a bright, airy space on a side street just off the main harbor drag, where she planned to showcase the work of emerging coastal artists. She loved Port Blossom's rugged beauty and had believed in its promise of a quieter, more community-focused life, a welcome antidote to the city's anonymous hustle. That afternoon, she was buzzing with the thrill of her new venture, carrying a large, flat box containing a new series of prints from an artist in Oregon. Distracted by the logistics of safely getting the artwork inside, she had pulled her compact sedan into what looked like an open spot, a few feet from a fire hydrant whose red paint was so chipped and faded it blended into the rust-colored brick of the adjacent building. A low-hanging branch from an old sycamore tree partially obscured a "no parking" sign that had clearly seen better days, its white letters peeling and streaked with green mildew. It was a simple, artless mistake born of excitement and preoccupation. An hour later, she stepped out of her gallery, a smile on her face from having successfully hung the new prints. The smile vanished when she saw the stark white rectangle of a parking ticket tucked beneath her car's windshield wiper. Her first feeling was a mild, self-reproaching annoyance, but it quickly gave way to a desire to simply clarify the situation. She saw the police cruiser parked just down the street and the officer standing beside it, arms crossed over his chest, watching her. He seemed to be waiting. With the ticket in her hand, Clara approached him, offering a small, deferential smile. "Excuse me, officer," she began, her voice polite and even. "I am so sorry about this, but I genuinely didn't see the sign. It's a bit hidden by that tree branch, and—" She never got to finish the sentence. Officer Jenkins cut her off, his voice a sharp, impatient bark that made her flinch. "Ignorance of the law is no excuse, ma'am." He took a deliberate step towards her, a subtle but unmistakable act of physical intimidation, closing the space between them. His eyes were cold, and his expression held a kind of smug satisfaction, as if he had been anticipating this exact conversation. His internal monologue was already running its triumphant script. Here we go. Another one of them who thinks the rules are optional, that a pretty smile is a get-out-of-jail-free card. Taken aback by his immediate hostility, Clara held her ground, though her heart began to beat a little faster. This wasn't the reaction she had expected. "I understand," she said, trying to keep her voice calm and respectful. "I'm not trying to make an excuse. I just wanted to point it out so maybe no one else makes the same mistake. If you could just—" That was as far as she got. Her attempt to be reasonable, to engage him in a logical conversation, was interpreted by Jenkins as a direct challenge to his authority. This was the disrespect he was always watching for. His face, already stern, hardened into a mask of cold fury. "Are you questioning me?" he snapped, his voice rising in volume. You got an attitude problem, lady. Before Clara could even formulate a response, before she could process the absurd accusation, he moved. The speed was shocking. He closed the remaining distance in a single step, his hand shooting out and clamping down on her arm like a vice. The strength in his grip was terrifying, a brutal, overwhelming force. With a practiced, violent motion, he wrenched her arm up and behind her back, causing a sharp, searing pain to shoot through her shoulder. The metallic sound of the handcuffs being unclipped was followed by the cold, shocking sensation of steel against her skin. Click, click. The two sharp sounds echoed on the quiet street, sealing her in a nightmare she couldn't comprehend. You're under arrest for disorderly conduct and resisting a lawful order. He growled into her ear, his voice thick with satisfaction. The words were meaningless. She hadn't been disorderly, and she hadn't resisted. She hadn't even had time to think. He then marched her, stunned and weeping, toward his cruiser. The short walk felt like a mile. She was acutely aware of every detail. The shocked face of the elderly owner of the hardware store peering out from his dusty window. A young couple on vacation stopping mid-stride to stare, their mouths slightly agape. Worst of all was the sight of the open door to her own gallery, her beautiful dream space, now the backdrop to her public shaming. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot, suffocating blanket. At the station, the process was a blur of cold, impersonal efficiency, fingerprints, paperwork, a mugshot. The questions were robotic, her answers choked and barely audible. A few hours later, a different officer released her with a dismissive wave and a warning. No charges were filed. The legal ordeal was over, but the emotional one had just begun. The fear that settled inside her wasn't of the law, but of the arbitrary and absolute power of the man who wielded it. Later that night, the bright, airy apartment above the gallery felt like a tomb. The smell of fresh paint, which had so recently filled her with hope, now seemed to mock her. Her husband, Mark, sat beside her on the sofa, gently dabbing antiseptic on the raw, red welts that circled her wrist. The silence was heavy, broken only by the distant sound of a foghorn. Clara stared at a blank spot on the wall opposite her, her gaze unfocused, seeing the afternoon's events play out again and again. Her voice, in when she finally spoke, was quiet and hollow. He didn't even look at the sign, Mark. He just looked at me. Mark sighed, his touch gentle as he finished his work. He set the cotton ball aside and took her hand in his. He's a bully, Clara. That's all. A sad, small man with a little bit of power who gets off on making other people feel smaller. He was trying to contain it, to make it a simple, isolated act of cruelty that they could understand and eventually move past. But Clara slowly shook her head, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. She knew it was more than that. No, she whispered, turning to look at him, her eyes filled with a weary, ancient knowledge. It was more than that. When he said, people like you, he wasn't talking about new business owners. The way he said it. Like I was an invasive species. She took a shaky breath, her voice cracking. I've heard that tone my whole life. It's the one that comes right before they ask you where you're really from. The incident with Clara Chen was a quiet, personal tragedy, a wound inflicted in plain sight but whose true depth was only felt in the privacy of her own home. It was, however, just one example of Jenkins's broader campaign against the changing face of Port Blossom. His contempt was not reserved solely for the new residents he viewed as racial outsiders. It extended to any group that challenged his rigid sense of order. He held a particular disdain for the town's youth, seeing their casual confidence in modern freedoms not as youthful energy, but as a form of insolence, a blatant disregard for the traditions and authority he held sacred. He believed they needed lessons in respect, and he was more than willing to be their teacher. His classroom, on this particular sun-drenched afternoon, was the Port Blossom Town Square. It was the historic heart of the community, A wide, open space paved with old granite slabs, centered around a stoic, verdigris-streaked statue of a Civil War general. Wide, inviting steps led up to the imposing doors of the town hall, their surfaces worn smooth by a century of footsteps. For a group of local teenagers, these steps and the low, broad ledges surrounding the monument were not a piece of history, but a perfect, ready-made skate park. The sharp clatter of urethane wheels on stone and the satisfying scrape of a skateboard grinding along a ledge echoed through the square, punctuated by the easy laughter of boys who were, for the moment, blissfully free. They were not malicious or destructive. The stone was ancient and already bore the scars of time. They were simply teenagers, alive and loud and claiming a small piece of public space for their own. That is, until Officer Walter Jenkins's cruiser rolled slowly, almost silently, and into the square. The vehicle's presence was an immediate and effective silencer. The laughter died, the clatter of wheels ceased, and a collective, wary stillness fell over the group. Jenkins exited the car with a deliberate, unhurried motion, his eyes scanning the teenagers, not as a group, but as a collection of potential infractions. He let the silence hang in the air, savoring the shift in atmosphere, the way their youthful confidence evaporated under his gaze and was replaced by a familiar, nervous apprehension. He didn't address them all. His eyes settled on one, Ethan, a skinny, lanky 15-year-old with a shock of unruly brown hair and the slightly awkward posture of a boy still growing into his own frame. Jenkins began to stride towards him, his boots making heavy, rhythmic sounds on the granite, ignoring the other boys who seemed to shrink as he passed. The approach was predatory, a clear and public singling out. Ethan watched him come, his heart thumping against his ribs. For a split second, his mind raced through the teenage calculus of a confrontation with authority. Run, argue, or submit. He chose submission. As Jenkins closed in, Ethan let his skateboard drop from his hand. It hit the stone with a loud, final-sounding clatter, a gesture of preemptive surrender. Jenkins stopped a few feet from him, looming. "What's your name, punk?" he demanded, the honorific a deliberate insult. "Ethan," the boy mumbled, his eyes fixed on the scuffed toes of his skate shoes. "Speak up. I can't hear you," Jenkins barked, enjoying the boy's discomfort. "Ethan." "Sir?" the boy repeated, a little louder this time. Jenkins smirked, a cold, unpleasant expression. He gestured vaguely at the empty square. "You and your friends think it's funny? Tearing up public property?" A flicker of youthful indignation cut through Ethan's fear. It wasn't fair. They were always careful. "We weren't tearing anything up, officer," he said, his voice earnest. "Just skateboarding." It was a simple statement of fact, offered by a boy who did not yet understand that in this classroom, facts were irrelevant. The only thing that mattered was power. Jenkins' smirk vanished, replaced by a look of grim satisfaction. He had his justification. "Talking back, huh?" He took another step forward, closing the remaining space until he was directly in Ethan's face. The boy could smell the stale coffee on his breath. "See?" Jenkins thought. "It always starts with the mouth. The first little spark of defiance." This was the moment he lived for. The moment a challenge was issued, allowing him to respond with overwhelming force. The motion was a blur of practiced violence. Jenkins's hand shot out and grabbed a fistful of Ethan's t-shirt, yanking him forward. He spun the boy around with a force that sent Ethan stumbling, his knee slamming into the back of Ethan's legs to buckle them. As Ethan gasped, Jenkins wrenched his thin arms behind his back and cinched the handcuffs on, pulling them deliberately tight. Ethan cried out, a sharp, high-pitched yelp of pain and shock. Jenkins ignored it completely, a placid expression on his face as he began to haul the now sobbing teenager towards the police cruiser. As he did, Officer Riley, a younger officer who had been observing from his own vehicle, felt a knot of dread tighten in his stomach. This was wrong. It was disproportionate and cruel. He jogged over, holding up a placating hand. Bill, hold on, Riley said, trying to keep his voice calm and respectful. A tone of mediation, not challenge. He's just a kid. Look at him. He's terrified. Maybe we just confiscate the board for a day? His parents can pick it up. He was offering a reasonable alternative, a way for Jenkins to assert his authority without brutalizing a child. Jenkins didn't stop walking, dragging the stumbling, weeping Ethan along with him, as if Riley hadn't spoken. "You're new here." "Riley," he said, his voice a low, condescending rumble. "You don't know how it works. You give them an inch. They take the whole damn town square." Riley, to his credit, hurried to keep pace, his desperation growing. "It's just skateboarding, for crying out loud. It's not a crime." It was a final, desperate appeal to reason, to the simple, objective truth of the situation. This time, Jenkins stopped. He stopped so abruptly that Riley almost ran into him. He turned his head slowly, his eyes, flat and cold as river stones, locking onto Riley's. His voice dropped to a low, menacing threat. "The crime is the defiance," he hissed. "You can't see it, but I can. It starts with the mouth. Then it's the fists. Then it's worse." He took a slight step towards Riley, a silent threat that made the younger officer instinctively recoil. "You keep handling things your way, with your understanding city compassion, and you'll be the one cleaning up the real mess later. Now get back in your vehicle." The last words were not a suggestion. They were a direct order, backed by the full weight of his seniority and the unspoken promise of departmental retribution. Riley visibly flinched, as if he'd been physically struck. The blood drained from his face. He looked from Jenkins's face, a mask of unbending, righteous fury, to Ethan's, a mess of tears and terror. He saw the vast, unbridgeable chasm between the two, and in that moment, he understood his own powerlessness. With a feeling of profound shame washing over him, he slowly backed away, his hands raised in a small, helpless gesture of surrender. He had tried, and he had failed. He watched, frozen in place, as Jenkins, his authority now absolute and unchallenged, shoved the boy into the back of the cruiser and slammed the door. Riley's feeling of shame as he walked back to his cruiser was a bitter, private pill to swallow, but his experience was far from unique. It was an unspoken rite of passage for any junior officer in the Port Blossom Police Department. You learned quickly, through observation and quiet warning, that there was an invisible but impenetrable wall around Officer Jenkins. Challenging him, questioning his methods, or even appearing to undermine his authority in the slightest way was a fast track to professional isolation. His wrath was not a storm to be weathered, but a climate to be navigated. And this silent conspiracy of avoidance was the key to survival. This institutional cowardice was born of simple, pragmatic calculation. Jenkins's colleagues, for the most part, were not bad men. They were simply tired men, trying to do a difficult job, pay their mortgages, and make it home to their families without incident. They knew Jenkins was a problem, a relic from a bygone era of policing, but he was a known problem. His outbursts were predictable. His targets were consistent, and most importantly, he was just a few years from collecting his pension. To formally challenge a near retiree with 30 years of institutional knowledge was viewed as a fool's errand, a pointless act of career suicide. Jenkins was a master of petty, bureaucratic warfare. He could forget to provide timely backup on a difficult call, misplace a crucial piece of evidence for a junior officer's case, or use his long-standing relationships to poison a reputation with whispers of incompetence. It was simply easier and safer to let the hammer fall where he may. So long as it wasn't on them, they told themselves they were just waiting him out, that the problem would soon solve itself with a gold watch and a retirement party. This pattern of willful blindness extended upwards to his direct supervisor, a weary sergeant who had long ago decided that managing Jenkins was about containment, not correction. His job was to minimize headaches for the chief of police and, by extension, the town council. When a formal complaint against Jenkins did manage to make its way to his desk, a familiar, tired ritual would unfold. The supervisor would call the aggrieved citizen, offer a practiced, world-weary apology, and make vague promises to have a word with the officer. The complaint would be filed away, but the word Jenkins received was rarely one of condemnation. Jenkins, or for his part, was an artist when it came to writing incident reports. He had perfected a dry official prose that could transform his own aggression into a model of professional caution. He employed a specific vocabulary of justification, a shield of jargon that was nearly impossible to penetrate. In his reports, victims were never polite, they were deceptively calm. They never asked questions, they displayed a non-compliant attitude. They never made sudden, innocent movements. They made furtive gestures. He could paint a picture of a routine traffic stop that made it sound like a life-or-death confrontation, making his use of force seem not just justified, but necessary. For his supervisor, it was easier to accept the report than to challenge the man who wrote it. The town itself was quietly complicit in this system of impunity. The powerful old guard, the established families and business owners, often tacitly approved of Jenkins's methods, especially when they were aimed at the very outsiders they themselves resented. They saw his heavy-handed approach not as a violation of civil rights, but as a welcome defense of the traditional Port Blossom they felt was under siege. From the town administration's perspective, it was a simple political calculation. It was far easier to manage the occasional complaint from a disenfranchised newcomer or the parents of a troublemaking teenager than it was to deal with the perceived societal disorder that Jenkins so loudly claimed to be preventing. In a way, he was a useful tool, a blunt instrument that maintained a certain kind of quiet at a manageable political cost. This complete and total lack of accountability from his peers, his superiors, and the town he policed created the perfect echo chamber for Walter Jenkins's ego. Every complaint that vanished into a bureaucratic black hole, every colleague who backed down, every tacit nod of approval was, in his mind, validation. It was proof that his methods were not only correct, but essential for the town's survival. This environment didn't just permit his behavior, it actively cultivated it. Over the years, it had inflated his professional confidence into a dangerous, godlike arrogance, solidifying his deeply held belief that he could operate however he pleased. He was no longer just an officer of the law. In his mind, he was the law itself. This deeply ingrained sense of supreme authority had a peculiar side effect. It created a profound and restless boredom in the absence of a challenge. A quiet night was not a blessing for Jenkins. It was an irritant. It felt like a personal affront when the world refused to provide him with a nail for his hammer. And so, his patrols were not merely observational. He did not simply drive around waiting for a law to be broken. He actively hunted for discrepancies, for anything, no matter how small, that seemed out of place in the tightly ordered tapestry of his worldview. He was a predator searching for the slightest imperfection, the one thread he could pull to unravel a situation and impose his will upon it. On this particular Tuesday evening, just after the sun had bled its last orange and purple hues below the horizon, such a thread had failed to present itself. The sky was darkening to a deep indigo, and the first streetlights on the quiet residential lane flickered to life, casting long, skeletal shadows from the manicured hedges and old oak trees. This was a street of small, well-kept cottages and modest bungalows, most of their windows already dark as families settled in for the night. The air was still and smelled of cut grass and the faint, sweet scent of blooming night jasmine. It was a portrait of tranquil, almost suffocating, domestic order. Inside his cruiser, Jenkins felt the familiar itch of impatience. He was slouched low in the driver's seat, the stiff body armor beneath his uniform, a constant, uncomfortable pressure against his ribs. One hand draped lazily over the top of the steering wheel, while the fingers of the other tapped a restless, staccato rhythm on the center console. The only sounds were the low hum of the engine and the occasional, unimportant crackle from the police radio. His eyes, accustomed to the gloom, scanned the empty sidewalks, the neatly parked cars, the dark windows of the houses. He wasn't watching over them like a guardian. He was scrutinizing them like a warden, frustrated by the impeccable behavior of his inmates. He was profoundly bored, and that boredom was slowly hardening into a need to find something, anything, to justify his presence on this placid, unremarkable street. Then he saw it, a dark-colored sedan, gliding almost silently around the gentle curve at the far end of the street. It was a newer model, a Lexus or perhaps an Acura, its deep blue paint catching the glow from the streetlights, making it look like a polished riverstone. It wasn't a flashy car, not a sports car designed to scream for attention, but it possessed an aura of quiet, expensive competence that made it utterly conspicuous in its surroundings. Lined up along the curb were the familiar vehicles of the neighborhood, a 10-year-old Ford Explorer, a slightly dented pickup truck with a ladder rack, a sensible minivan with a child's car seat visible in the back. Against this backdrop of practical, domestic machinery, the sedan stood out like a tuxedo at a barn dance. To any other observer, it would have been a fleeting, unimportant detail. To Jenkins's prowling gaze, it was an anomaly, and an anomaly was a reason. He sat up straighter, his boredom instantly vanishing, replaced by a sharp, focused alertness. He watched the car's progress. There was no obvious traffic violation. It wasn't speeding. Its tires weren't crossing the center line. Its headlights were on, but it was being driven slowly. Jenkins narrowed his eyes. It was too slow. It was the deliberate, searching pace of someone who was either lost or looking for something. Casing, the word formed, solid and certain, in his mind. He squinted, trying to make out the driver, and could just discern the silhouette of a man. His head angled slightly as if in deep thought. It was a look Jenkins, through the lens of his own suspicion, interpreted not as contemplation, but as calculation. The sight of it all, the expensive car on the modest street, the suspiciously slow speed, the out-of-place driver, coalesced in Jenkins's mind into a single, undeniable narrative of wrongdoing. It was a gut feeling, a familiar, prickling conviction that he had learned to trust above all else. This person did not belong here. This car did not belong here. Therefore, its presence was a direct challenge to the natural order of things, a disruption he was uniquely qualified to investigate and correct. The internal justification was complete. The decision to act had already been made. He flicked a switch on the console. Instantly, the tranquil twilight was shattered. A chaotic, strobing pulse of red and blue light erupted from the roof of the cruiser, painting the quiet houses and peaceful trees in silent, screaming colors. He didn't merely follow the sedan. As he accelerated, he angled his vehicle sharply, positioning his cruiser not just behind the car, but diagonally, effectively blocking the narrow residential street. It was an aggressive, tactical maneuver designed to intimidate and eliminate any possibility of flight. It was not a stop, it was a trap. In response, the sedan's brake lights flared a brilliant, immediate red. Without a hint of hesitation or panic, the car glided smoothly to a stop against the right-hand curb, its movements perfectly calm and compliant. Jenkins let the silence stretch. He didn't get out of his car immediately. He let the driver of the sedan sit and wait, bathed in the disorienting, pulsing lights, a deliberate tactic designed to amplify anxiety and establish dominance before a single word was spoken. The man's perfect compliance was, in Jenkins's mind, a form of deceit, an attempt to project an innocence that couldn't possibly be real. After a long, calculated moment, he pushed his door open, the heavy groan of its hinges the first sound to break the tense quiet. He emerged slowly, a predator savoring the approach, his shadow long and distorted in the chaotic strobing of the emergency lights. He walked with a deliberate, rolling gait, his boots heavy on the asphalt. His flashlight, a long, heavy mag light, was held not loosely, but gripped like a baton in his left hand. His right hand rested casually, almost proprietorially, on the hard plastic grip of his service weapon. a gesture that was both unconscious habit and a carefully projected nonverbal threat. As he reached the driver's side door, the window glided down with a soft, electronic whir. The man inside turned to face him, and Jenkins felt an immediate, jarring sense of dissonance. He had been expecting someone else, a young punk, a shifty-eyed drug dealer, someone whose appearance would instantly validate his suspicions. The reality was something entirely different. The driver was a black man in his early 50s, his face framed by a neat, distinguished cut of salt and pepper hair. He was dressed in what was clearly a high-quality, if slightly rumpled, suit jacket. His face was intelligent and composed, though etched with fine lines of exhaustion around the eyes, the deep-set marks of a man who worked long, demanding hours. But what struck Jenkins most forcefully was the man's expression. It was one of pure, unadulterated calm. There was no fear in his eyes, no nervous tick, no desperate, placating smile. He simply sat there, watching Jenkins approach, his gaze steady and appraising. It was the look of a man who was annoyed, perhaps, but not intimidated. And that, more than anything, set Jenkins's teeth on edge. Jenkins planted his feet, assuming the classic officer stance, a position of interrogation and power. He leaned down slightly, bringing his face closer to the open window. He did not offer a greeting. He did not state his name or the reason for the stop. He opened with a barked command, his tone clipped and stripped of all courtesy. "License and registration." The driver didn't flinch. He gave a single, slow blink, as if processing the rudeness of the command. His voice, when he spoke, was a low, steady baritone, the voice of a man accustomed to being listened to. "Of course, an officer," he said quietly. He made no immediate move for his documents. Instead, he asked a simple, direct question. "May I ask why I've been stopped?" The question landed in the small space between them like a thrown gauntlet. To a reasonable person, it was a fair and standard inquiry. To Jenkins, it was an immediate and intolerable challenge to his absolute authority. It implied that his actions required justification, that his judgment was subject to review by the very person he was investigating. A hot surge of anger, familiar and bracing, flooded his chest. "Who the hell does this guy think he is?" his mind screamed. He felt the need to immediately regain control, to put this man on the defensive. He narrowed his eyes, his voice taking on a sarcastic, accusatory edge. "You seemed a little lost," he began, letting the insinuation hang in the air. "Driving a high-end car like this, it stands out around here." He paused, letting the man absorb the implication. A black man in a car like this doesn't belong in a neighborhood like this. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping. "We've had some reports of unauthorized salesmen. You're not selling anything, are you?" It was a baseless, insulting accusation, designed to provoke a reaction, to see if he could get a flash of anger or fear. He got neither. The driver's expression remained a mask of placid neutrality. He seemed utterly unimpressed by the performance, with slow, deliberate movements that were clearly meant to be non-threatening. The man reached into his jacket for his wallet and leaned over to open the glove compartment for the vehicle's registration. "No, officer," he said, his voice as steady as a surgeon's hand. "I am not selling anything. I'm a lawyer visiting a colleague. I'm looking for number 14. He held the documents out through the window. Jenkins snatched the license and registration from the man's hand, a flicker of annoyance passing through him at the man's continued composure. He barely glanced at them. The name Arthur Pendleton meant nothing to him. The photo confirmed the man's identity. The registration confirmed the car was his. The facts were irrelevant. The facts were getting in the way of the narrative he had already constructed. He clicked on his mag light, casting a blindingly bright, concentrated beam of white light directly into the driver's eyes. It was a petty, aggressive act, meant to disorient and punish the man for his calm. Pendleton shielded his eyes slightly but didn't complain. Jenkins stared at the license again, pretending to read it, though his focus was entirely on the man in the car. "A lawyer, huh?" he scoffed, the sound dripping with a thick, undisguised derision. He imagined the man in some fancy downtown office, arrogant and condescending. Big firm downtown? Must be some very important business to bring you all the way out to this part of Port Blossom after dark. The insults were layered. You think you're important. You have no legitimate business here. A person like you, in a place like this, at this time of night, is inherently suspicious. For the first time, a flicker of a reaction appeared on the driver's face. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a minute flexing of a muscle along his cheek. The mask of pure calm was replaced by one of profound, weary patience. He had weathered the baseless questions and the thinly veiled insults. He had complied with every command. Now, he would draw a line. His voice, when he spoke, was still quiet, but it had a new resonance, a new precision that hinted at the courtroom. I'm afraid I don't see how my profession, or the nature of my business, is relevant to a traffic stop. Officer, it was not a question. It was a statement of legal principle, delivered politely but with an unmistakable edge of authority. That was it. That was the final straw. The calm, reasoned, legally sound pushback was, to Jenkins, the ultimate form of mockery. This man, this outsider in his expensive suit and his luxury car, was not cowering. He was not making excuses. He was not showing the proper fear. He was calmly, rationally, and intelligently using the very concept of the law as a shield against the man who was supposed to embody it. It felt like a personal attack, a deliberate attempt to make him feel stupid and unsophisticated. The man's composure was no longer just irritating, it was insulting. It was a declaration that he believed he was Jenkins's equal, or perhaps even his superior. In the warped hierarchy of Jenkins' world, this was the most egregious crime of all. The rage inside him, which had been simmering, now boiled over into a cold, hard decision. This man had an attitude. This man needed to be taught a lesson in respect. This man needed to be put in his place. The switch inside Jenkins's mind had been flipped. The part of him capable of conversation, of reason, however flawed, was now dormant. In its place was the hammer, the cold, decisive instrument of order he believed himself to be. The man's calm, intelligent defiance was a fire that needed to be extinguished, and Jenkins had the only tool for the job. The law, in its beautiful vagueness, provided the perfect justification. He would no longer debate the relevance of his questions. He would simply end the conversation entirely. His voice, when he spoke, had lost all traces of its earlier derision, replaced now by a flat, hard finality. It was the voice of a man issuing a verdict. "All right, that's enough," he declared, cutting through the tense silence. He took a half step back from the car door, creating space for what was to come. "Your attitude is non-compliant. You're being detained." He weaponized the word attitude, transforming a subjective feeling, a personal offense, into an official, arrestable charge. It was his ultimate trump card, the one that could never be disproven. The man's calm was his crime. His reason was his resistance. Jenkins's hands went to his belt, his fingers finding the familiar, cold steel of his handcuffs. He issued the final commands as a series of sharp, staccato barks, each word a hammer blow. "Get out of the car, hands behind your back. Now." The last word hung in the air, pregnant with the unspoken threat of immediate, overwhelming violence should he fail to comply instantly. For the first time since the stop began, a clear expression of surprise registered on the driver's face. His eyes widened, not in terror, but in sheer disbelief at the breathtaking irrationality of the escalation. He had been insulted, demeaned, and interrogated without cause, and now, for the crime of calmly asserting his rights, he was being arrested. A flicker of something, outrage perhaps, passed through his eyes, but it was just as quickly suppressed, replaced by a steely, pragmatic calm. His mind, honed by decades in the courtroom, performed a lightning-fast calculation. He knew his rights. He also knew that, for a black man on a dark road with an aggressive police officer, asserting those rights physically was a potential death sentence. The legal fight would come later. The immediate priority was survival. He made the cold, calculated decision to comply with the illegal order to ensure he would live to challenge it. With movements that were impossibly slow and deliberate, he put his hands on the steering wheel where Jenkins could see them. Then, he unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the car door. He emerged from the vehicle, a tall, well-built man who, even in this moment of extreme duress, carried himself with an air of quiet dignity. He did not look at Jenkins. He kept his eyes focused straight ahead, on the pulsing red and blue lights painting the side of his neighbor's house, as ordered. He turned his back to the officer, an act of profound vulnerability. He raised his hands slightly and placed them behind his back, his posture perfectly straight, his shoulders squared. He was a man complying with a command, but he was not a man submitting in spirit. For Jenkins, this was the moment of ultimate victory. This was the part he craved. He approached from behind, the soft, metallic clinking of the handcuffs the only sound in the suddenly silent street. This was the culmination of the entire encounter. The defiant man, now turned and helpless, awaiting his punishment. He grabbed the man's wrist with a firm, proprietary grip, his thumb digging into the sensitive pressure point on the man's right wrist. He felt a satisfying, involuntary flinch. He brought the two wrists together roughly and, with a single, practiced motion, cinched the cold, heavy steel of the handcuffs around them. The sharp, double click of the locking mechanism was, to Jenkins, the most satisfying sound in the world. It was the sound of an argument won, of order restored, of his absolute power made manifest. He gave the cuffs a hard, final tug, a gesture of ownership. He stepped back to admire his handiwork, a self-satisfied smirk spreading across his face. The smart-ass lawyer was now just another cuffed perpetrator, helpless and bound. The power differential was total. Jenkins felt a heady rush of triumph. "There," he said, his voice thick with smug satisfaction. "All done." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a low, venomous sneer. "Let's see you talk your way out of this one, smart-ass." The man in the handcuffs did not respond immediately. He did not tremble. He did not plead. He simply stood there for a long moment, a statue of dignity in the chaotic, flashing lights. His shoulders were straight. His head was held high. When he finally spoke, his voice was unchanged. It was still the calm, steady, resonant baritone of a man in complete control of himself, and it cut through Jenkins's triumphant haze like a surgeon's scalpel. "Officer Jenkins," he said, the use of Jenkins's name a subtle but powerful reclamation of authority. "You've made a very serious mistake tonight." The words were delivered not as a threat, but as a cool, clinical diagnosis of the situation. It was a statement of irrefutable fact. Jenkins chuckled, though the sound lacked some of its earlier confidence. The man's unshakable composure was beginning to feel less like defiance and more like something else, something he couldn't quite identify. "Oh, yeah," Jenkins snapped, trying to reassert his dominance. "What mistake is that? Cuffing you?" "Nah, that wasn't a mistake. That was the point." To prove his total control, he reached toward the man's back pocket, intending to pull out his wallet and rifle through it. It was that act, that final, intimate violation, that prompted the man to continue. As Jenkins's fingers brushed against the fabric of his trousers, the man spoke again, his voice gaining a quiet, almost academic intensity. "The mistake, officer," he began, his tone that of a professor lecturing a student, "is that you have, in the last 5 minutes, committed a series of profound and actionable legal violations." Jenkins paused, his hand hovering over the man's pocket. He was listening now, a flicker of genuine unease starting in his gut. The cuffed man continued, his voice clear and precise, a metronome of legal terminology. "You initiated a traffic stop without reasonable, articulable suspicion, a clear violation of the Fourth Amendment. You then proceeded to conduct a custodial interrogation without a Miranda warning, asking questions that had no relevance to any legitimate law enforcement purpose. You employed a flashlight to deliberately disorient and intimidate me, which can be construed as an act of physical assault. Each word was perfectly enunciated, each concept perfectly clear. This wasn't the panic babbling of a common arrestee. This was the language of the courtroom, of depositions, of legal briefs. And you have now subjected me to an illegal arrest, using a non-compliant attitude as a pretext. Contempt of cop is not a chargeable offense in this state. Officer, you have done all of this under color of law, willfully abusing the authority granted to you by the state. The flow of precise legal language stunned Jenkins into a momentary silence. The triumphant smirk had vanished from his face, replaced by a frown of confusion and a growing, sickening dread. He finally found his voice, though it lacked its earlier power. "Who the hell do you think you are?" he snapped. "Giving me a lecture?" The man in the handcuffs slowly turned his head, looking over his shoulder, his eyes calm and intelligent, met Jenkins in the pulsing lights. There was no fear in them. There was no anger. There was only a profound, almost pitying certainty. "My name," the man said, his voice low and deliberate, each word landing with the weight of a gavel, "is Victor Pendleton." He paused, letting the name hang in the cold night air. He could see the dawning, horrified recognition in Jenkins' eyes, the gears turning frantically behind them. He saw the exact moment the connection was made. Then he delivered the final, world-shattering blow. "I am the senior partner at Pendleton and Associates," he said, his voice remaining impossibly, devastatingly calm. "We specialize in civil rights litigation, cases exactly like this one." The words did not just register in Jenkins's mind, they detonated. For a long, silent moment, the entire world seemed to freeze. The pulsing red and blue lights, the distant hum of the town, the very air he was breathing, it all ceased to exist. There was only the name, Victor Pendleton, and the catastrophic weight of its meaning. It was a name he now vaguely recalled from departmental bulletins and hushed, resentful conversations among other cops. A legal boogeyman, the lawyer who specialized in dismantling careers like his, the smartass, the jerk, the outsider he had decided to teach a lesson was, in fact, the one man on the planet he should have avoided at all costs. The blood drained from Jenkins's face, leaving it a sickly, grayish white under the strobing lights. The self-satisfied smirk that had been plastered there moments before melted away, replaced by an expression of slack-jawed, primal horror. The strength evaporated from his limbs, his fingers going numb and clumsy. The wallet he had triumphantly stolen from Pendleton's pocket, the trophy of his conquest, slipped from his nerveless grasp and fell to the asphalt with a soft, pathetic thud. His eyes, which had been so full of cold fury, were now wide, vacant discs, staring at the man he had just bound, but no longer seeing a perpetrator. He was seeing the architect of his own ruin. A tidal wave of pure, unadulterated terror washed over him, so potent it made him physically tremble. It was not just the fear of losing his job or his pension. It was a far deeper, more existential dread, the terror of a God who has just discovered he is mortal after all. He saw his entire life, his 30 years on the force, his reputation, his house, his very identity as a man of power, crumbling into dust in the span of a single sentence. The hammer had brought his tool down with all his might, only to discover he had struck an anvil that had just shattered his arm. "Oh, God," he breathed, the words a pathetic, wheezing gasp. His mind, which had been so clear in righteous moments before, was now a maelstrom of panic. "Undo it! You have to undo it!" He fumbled frantically at his belt for his handcuff key, his hands shaking so violently that the simple, practiced act became a monumental challenge. The small piece of metal felt alien in his grasp. He couldn't seem to guide it toward the keyhole on the cuffs. "Mr. Pendleton," he babbled, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. "Sir, I..." I didn't know. I swear to God, it was a mistake. A terrible mistake. He dropped the key, the tiny metallic clink lost in the sound of his own ragged breathing. He scrambled to pick it up, his movements clumsy and pathetic. Just a routine stop, sir. The car, it matched a description. I thought you had an attitude. The excuses tumbled out, a desperate, incoherent torrent of lies and half-truths, the frantic babbling of a guilty man trying to rewrite history. He finally managed to get the key into the lock. He turned it, and with a soft click, one cuff fell open. He moved to the other, his fingers fumbling, and unlocked it as well. The heavy steel fell away from Victor Pendleton's wrists. Pendleton did not say anything. He slowly brought his hands around to his front, deliberately and methodically rubbing his wrists where the angry red welts were already beginning to darken. He watched Jenkins's pathetic, frantic meltdown with the cool, clinical detachment of an observer watching a chemical reaction. He saw no remorse in the man's terrified eyes, no flicker of regret for the abuse he had inflicted. He saw only the raw, animal fear of a cornered bully who had just realized his victim could bite back, and bite back hard. The babbling apologies were meaningless, nothing more than a desperate attempt at self-preservation. After a long moment, Pendleton's gaze hardened. "It's too late for that, officer," he stated, his voice devoid of all its earlier patience. It was now flat and final. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out his phone. In the swirling chaos of the flashing lights and Jenkins's panicked hyperventilating, the simple, calm action was one of immense and terrible power. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to threaten. He held the sum of Jenkins' professional future in the palm of his hand. With a few taps of his thumb, he found the number he was looking for in his contacts. He pressed the screen and lifted the phone to his ear. "Chief O'Connell, please," he said into the phone, his voice as calm as if he were ordering dinner. There was a brief pause. "Yes, I'll hold." He stood there, waiting, his eyes never leaving Jenkins's terrified face. Jenkins could only watch, frozen, as his entire world was dismantled by a single, quiet phone call. "Chief O'Connell," Pendleton said again. "Good evening. This is Victor Pendleton." "Yes, that's right. I'm calling you from the side of a road in one of your residential neighborhoods. I've just been subjected to an illegal stop and a false arrest by one of your officers, a man named Walter Jenkins. Badge number 2S17. The response was immediate. Within 3 minutes, the sound of more sirens filled the air, this time approaching with a frantic urgency. The quiet residential street was suddenly flooded with more police cars, their lights adding to the chaotic scene. But the atmosphere was entirely different. Officers emerged from their vehicles not with aggression, but with grim, worried expressions. They saw Jenkins, Pendleton, and the open handcuffs, and they understood instantly that something had gone terribly wrong. The police chief, a man named O'Connell, arrived in an unmarked sedan, driving it himself. He was a portly man in his late 50s, and he looked as though he had been pulled away from his dinner table, his face a mask of profound concern and barely concealed anger. He saw Victor Pendleton and his shoulders slumped in a gesture of defeat. He strode directly to him, extending a hand. "Mr. Pendleton," he said, his voice grave. "I am Chief O'Connell. I am so sorry for this. I came as soon as I got your call." While they spoke, other officers quietly moved Jenkins to the side, standing near him but not speaking to him. His colleagues, the men he had worked with for years, refused to meet his gaze. The hammer had finally been silenced. O'Connell led Pendleton a few steps away, toward the front of Pendleton's car, creating a small pocket of privacy away from the now silent Jenkins. "Mr. Pendleton, again, on behalf of the entire Port Blossom Police Department, I am profoundly sorry," O'Connell said, his voice a low, urgent murmur. "I want to assure you that Officer Jenkins will be disciplined to the fullest extent. This is not who we are. This is a deep embarrassment to us." He was in full damage control mode, trying to frame the incident as the regrettable action of a single, rogue officer. Pendleton looked down at the angry red marks circling his own wrists, then back up at the chief. "Chief," he said, his voice calm but sharp. "With all due respect, embarrassment is what you feel when a guest spills wine on your carpet. This was a flagrant, unconstitutional abuse of power." He held the chief's gaze. "And it wasn't an isolated incident, was it?" O'Connell visibly hesitated. His eyes, for a split second, darted over to where Jenkins stood, a silent, damning admission. He sighed, a sound of pure exhaustion. "Bill, he can be heavy-handed," the chief admitted, the words tasting like poison. "We've had, complaints." "Complaints," Pendleton repeated, the single word soft but laden with implication. "And what were the dispositions of those complaints? Chief? Filed? Sustained? Did Officer Jenkins receive retraining? A suspension? Or were they, perhaps, managed and smoothed over?" The chief cleared his throat, a flush creeping up his neck. "We handle these matters internally, and that is the problem." Pendleton cut him off, his voice no longer calm, but sharp as shattered glass. "Your internal handling has resulted in my illegal detainment tonight. This is no longer an internal matter." He stood up to his full height, a figure of absolute authority. "I will be filing a formal request under the Freedom of Information Act for every complaint filed against this officer for the last 10 years, along with the department's official response to each one. We will see exactly how you've handled things." He took a step closer to the chief, his eyes burning with a cold, righteous fire. "This isn't about one hammer, Chief. It's about the house he was allowed to build." Chief O'Connell stood frozen on the asphalt, the flashing lights reflecting in his wide, stunned eyes. Pendleton's final words echoed in the space between them, less an accusation and more a final judgment. In that moment, the chief understood with chilling clarity that this was no longer a situation that could be managed with an internal review and a quiet suspension. The quiet residential street had become the scene of a declaration of war, and Victor Pendleton was not a man who made idle threats. The protective walls of the department had been breached, and the public, legal, and financial storm that was about to break over Port Blossom would be swift and merciless. The investigation that followed was unlike any the Port Blossom Police Department had ever experienced. It was not the usual slow, internal affair, a process designed to protect its own and placate the public with a veneer of due diligence. Framed by Victor Pendleton's formal, immaculately detailed complaint and the ever-present threat of his high-powered law firm, the investigation was swift, decisive, and intensely scrutinized. State investigators were brought in, their presence a clear signal that the department could no longer be trusted to police itself. Every document was subpoenaed, every report was analyzed, and every action taken by Officer Jenkins that fateful night was placed under a microscope. The narrative was no longer his to control. It had been seized and defined by the very man he had tried to silence. As Pendleton's legal team applied pressure, the official investigation began to pull at the threads of Jenkins's long, unchecked career. It quickly became clear that the incident on the quiet residential street was not an aberration, but the culmination of a deeply ingrained pattern. Investigators, armed with a mandate they had never had before, began to proactively look for other victims. They reviewed years of dismissed complaints and flagged incident reports that bore Jenkins's signature justification, a non-compliant attitude. They didn't wait for people to come to them. They went out into the community, asking questions and creating a safe space for people to finally speak. The response was a slow, then steady, trickle of stories that soon became a flood. Clara Chen, reading about the incident in the local paper, felt a jolt of recognition and fear. With her husband's encouragement, she found the courage to step forward, her voice shaking but firm as she gave her official statement, describing the humiliation and the racialized fear she had felt. The parents of a teenager named Ethan, who had long ago dismissed their son's arrest as a scary but isolated run-in with a bully cop, now saw it in a new, more sinister light. They too came forward, their son's story adding another crucial piece to the mosaic of abuse. Others emerged from the shadows, a day laborer who had been illegally searched, a young woman who had been verbally abused during a traffic stop, all of them previously too afraid or too powerless to fight back. Their combined testimonies painted an undeniable portrait of a man who had used his badge as a weapon for years, operating with the absolute certainty that he would never be held accountable. The downfall of Hammer Jenkins was as swift and brutal as the arrest he had so enjoyed making. He was summarily fired from the Port Blossom Police Department, a termination effective immediately. In a sterile 10-minute meeting with Chief O'Connell, he was stripped of the badge and the gun that had been the core of his identity for 3 decades. The pension he had been counting down the days to, the financial bedrock of his future, was revoked due to the nature of his termination for gross misconduct. But the consequences did not end there. Victor Pendleton, true to his word, pursued the matter with the full force of his firm. A federal civil rights lawsuit was filed against Walter Jenkins personally and against the Port Blossom Police Department for its systemic failure to train and supervise its officers. The man who had derived such pleasure from the humiliation of others now faced the cold, public reality of legal proceedings, the depositions under oath, the public filings detailing his history of abuse, the slow, grinding process of the very legal system he had so arrogantly twisted to serve his own ends. The incident acted as a powerful, painful catalyst for change within the beleaguered department, under the imminent threat of a catastrophic lawsuit that would have bankrupted the town. Chief O'Connell was forced to implement sweeping reforms. New ironclad policies regarding the use of force and restraints were drafted, with explicit prohibitions against using arrests to punish for contempt of cop. The entire civilian complaint process was overhauled, with a new level of transparency and an independent oversight committee established to ensure that no complaint could ever again be smoothed over or buried. Mandatory, ongoing training in de-escalation, cultural sensitivity, and constitutional rights became a requirement for every officer on the force. The house that Jenkins had built, a house of fear and impunity, was being publicly and systematically dismantled, brick by brick. Weeks later, driving away from Port Blossom after a preliminary hearing, Victor Pendleton looked out at the rugged coastline, the sea churning under a gray sky. He felt no sense of personal triumph, no joy in the ruin of Walter Jenkins' life. He saw it only as a sad but necessary correction, the inevitable consequence of arrogance colliding with accountability. He thought about the unique confluence of events that had led to this outcome. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that his ability to fight back had been a profound privilege. Had he been a fisherman, a plumber, a tourist, or any other man without his name, his resources, and his intimate knowledge of the law, the story would have ended on that dark street. The complaint would have been dismissed, and the hammer would still be on patrol. This realization did not make him cynical. Instead, it sharpened his focus and fueled the deep-seated commitment that had guided his entire career. His own brief, ugly experience of the injustice he had spent his life fighting had made the abstract viscerally real. It solidified his resolve to wield his privilege not as a shield for himself, but as a sword for those who had none. The fight wasn't just about winning cases. It was about ensuring that one day, a person's dignity and rights would not depend on their name, their profession, or their ability to hire a lawyer like him. It would simply be a given. And until that day came, he would keep fighting.